we're very lucky, Paul, because you think about all these people that have brought their contribution to American soil, whether it be Greek, Thai, all the regions of India, all the regions of China, Japan, Korea. I mean, it's amazing. I think we're so lucky.
Sit back and grab a glass. It's Wine Talks with Paul K.
Going to Wine Talks with Paul K, and we are in studio today in beautiful Southern California, Monrovia, broadcasting all the way through to New York with our good friend Jonathan Waxman. We'll get to introductions in a second. Wine Talks is available, of course, on Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, wherever you hang out for your podcasts, and always sponsored by the original Wine of the Month Club, now sporting the Bordeaux and Napa Series wine clubs. This is such an honor to have you on the show, Jonathan. Mr. Waxman, chef, probably have lots of accolades. Thank you for being on the show today.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
Just starting out, I mean, it is 65 degrees today in Southern California. How about?
Well, it's interesting, Paul. Yesterday in New York, it was almost 50 degrees, and I was talking to one of my ex-chefs in Houston. It was 10 degrees. So the world is topsy-turvy.
We probably have to talk about climate change and the world of wine as well. I did want to say one thing, though. Going through this and wanted to have you on the show, and I've read Chef's Drugs and Rock and Roll. I've read your 3 cookbooks, or at least the intros and prologues and things. But we have a pretty amazing list of mutual friends, not the least of which is our friend Melvin Masters, who, I don't know, I think I've been buying from him for probably 30 years now. But Bruce Nyers, an old friend, used to sell wine to my dad in the 70s.
That's so funny. Yeah. So I first met Melvin in 1979 when I was at Michael's, and he was at Jordan Winery at that point. And he was the wine director for Tom Jordan and getting the winery open. And I was picked to do the opening dinners at the Jordan Winery by Melvin. And Tom was very generous, and he said, "Look, what are you going to serve?" I said, "I don't know, Tom." He goes, "Well, that sounds great. Here's my plane. Fly around wherever you want in California, and pick up whatever you needed." A true story. And so I arrived. I was working for Michael McCarty at the time, and it was Michael, myself, and Nancy Silverton, I think, was one of the sous chefs, and we arrived at Jordan on this turboprop plane, and the wings were filled with food, and we just unpacked, Catalina lobsters that I picked up literally in Santa Barbara.
Wow.
Lambs from Sonoma. I got king salmon that we picked up in Point Reyes, and it was, and I get off the plane, and Melvin and Janie were there to meet me, and they go, "So, what are you making for the first dinner night?" I said, "I have no clue. Let's pick out the food." And we unpacked all the stuff. We laid it out in this beautiful kitchen they had at the Jordan Winery, and I just sort of walked around and picked out some stuff. But what I really wanted to know was what kind of wines they wanted to serve. That was because they hadn't told me ahead of time. So, and I always feel that wine comes first, food comes second. So I wanted to make sure that whatever we served married up well. So Melvin then proposed to have lunch, and I remember I got some of the lamb legs from the spring lambs from Sonoma, and I cooked lunch, and of course he had Beaujolais for lunch, not Jordan. And I remember the lunch went to about 5:30 in the afternoon, and all of a sudden we realized we had to cook dinner that night for the dinner. But it all, those days you had more stamina than a horse, and it all worked out well.
So anyway, I've got all this conversation to talk about Michael's and Nancy and Janie and Melvin, but was that normal to just get on a plane and start going around and pick up your?
No, it was nothing was ever normal about anything I did with Melvin, to be honest with you.
Yes. Character.
Character and a half. And Melvin and I became best friends. We bonded over that, and we ended up becoming partners. And
I read that.
3 restaurants in New York starting in 1983.
Was Janie part of that? She was a trained chef. Didn't she work at Chez Panisse for a while?
Janie, it's funny. What happened was, I had been at Michael's since 1979. It was 1983, and I wanted to move to New York for some reason. Don't ask me why.
Mm-hmm.
And Melvin invited me for lunch at the Four Seasons when I was in New York. It was Janie's birthday, actually. And we had lunch at Four Seasons. And back then, the Four Seasons was the most magnificent place to have lunch. And we sat and had one of those lunches that, went from 12 to whenever, till dinner. And during that lunch, Melvin and Janie said they had moved to New York and they wanted to open up a fish restaurant and name it after Billingsgate, the old fish market in London, which is sadly no longer there anymore. And they said, we'd like to have you think about becoming the chef for the restaurant. And I said, well, it's funny you said that. I'm actually thinking about moving to New York. So we talk about it. Anyway, so long story short, we ended up sort of changing Billingsgate to, more of a Waxman style restaurant. And Jenny gracefully said that, why don't you be the chef? And, I'll be there, but not in a real active role. And Melvin and I started Jams, which stood for Jonathan and Melvin.
Wow, I didn't read that in the thing that's what it stood for. Janie's a trained cordon bleu, I think, right?
She's a magnificent cook.
Yeah.
It might have been better for his marriage that he didn't do this with Janie. So who knows? But
that happens.
I remember. So Paul, the funny thing was, they had bought a house up in Bethlehem, Connecticut. So we used to go up there before we found a space. In New York, there's an old adage: you either have a space and you don't have an investor, or you find an investor, you don't have a space. So at that point, we had a space but no investors, and we were desperately seeking a name. And Melvin and I were stuck on the bus coming back from Bethlehem, next to the bathroom, and it was pretty disgusting. And going back to New York early in the morning, and he looked at me with his sort of baleful eyes, said, "We have to come up with a name right now." So I just blurted out, "I don't know." And he goes, in French, there's this expression, "La vie dure sans confiture," which means life is not worth living without jam, which really means life isn't worth living without cash. Confiture meaning money.
Yes, right.
And so we just said, we both said at the same time, jam, and that's how Jonathan, Melvin, and then the S, I'm not going to tell you what that means.
Well, all right, so that's Mel, and Mel is Mel. In fact, he's been in here in the studio last time he was in town, and he's promised magnums at Willie's Wine Bar when all this clears up. So we'll get you on the list. Because,
through Melvin, Mark and I became very good friends. So I've been going to Willie's.
It's the greatest
since the beginning, and
so that's 83, I think, when he started.
I think 1980, because it's been exactly that.
Oh yeah, he just released his book. Well, I have
got his book.
I have a poster in my house. It's the 1986 or 87, Willie's poster that my dad brought back. And he also had an autographed menu that Mark had signed. And we were up in Napa, my wife and I, during COVID, actually. I was doing some podcasting, and we were walking down through Yountville, and there's a little condo complex on the right side as you're headed into Yountville from the north. And I spy my wife actually spies a poster through the window. So here we are, like peeping toms, looking through this guy's living room window, and there's a Willie's Wine Bar poster. It wasn't the same one, but it was. And my wife goes, "That looks like a Willie's type poster." And so lo and behold, I took a picture and emailed it to Mark. He says, "Yeah, that's one of our posters." He says, "Where is this?" I go, "It's Yountville, Napa." I said, "You were already out here. People are paying attention." But then I was watching one of the TV stations during COVID. It was on the news station, and over the guy's shoulder, who's in broadcasting from his home, is the poster that I have in my house, a Willie's poster. So I took a quick still shot of that and sent that to Mark, and we became friends through this communication, and because of Melvin is too. So you're in magnums at Willie's. I don't know. I suppose summertime or sometime before it frees up. But how about Bruce Nyers? I was talking to Bruce the other day, had him on the podcast as well. He used to come to see my father in 1972 and 75 and sell him wine from Joseph Phelps. What he says, he goes, "Oh, you got to say hi to Jonathan for me." So,
I first met Bruce when I worked at Chez Panisse in 1977. And I had worked in Napa. Actually, maybe before that, because I had worked at Domaine Chandon in Napa Valley. I think I met him then, or Barbara. I can't remember who I met first. Yeah. But Barbara was great friends with Alice, of course, and as was Bruce. And Chez Panisse was nothing but a kind of a great place to have friends hang out and have dinner and drink wine and talk stories. And that's when I first met Bruce. But I got to know Bruce even better when I was at Michael's. Alice threw a 10th anniversary party at Phelps in 1981, and invited Michael and myself up with our then girlfriends, and Bruce and I spent a lot of time at that party for some reason, drinking margaritas and talking about life, and we bonded. And then he used to come out and hang out at Wally's. Was Steve Wallace had become a really good friend, and so I used to spend a lot of time with Steve and Bruce. And,
what a party!
Carl Domaney and that whole group of people. And Paul, it was really a remarkable time, I have to tell you.
And we're going to talk about Michael's in that period. Ken Frank, we've been friends. He's been on the show. He wants me to come back up to La Toque and do another show. But one that surprised me, we'll get into the guts of this conversation, but I was talking to Mark Toll yesterday. He's a vendor. He's been around the wine business for a long time. And he says, well, Jonathan Waxman used to stay at Sandy Garber's house when he came into town.
That's actually a kind of funny story. So when I was at Domaine Chandon, I started off in the pastry department, and then I moved over to the savory department, and I used to cook lunch. That was my job. And one of the waiters was a guy named Ralph Meyer, and Ralph and Steve Gordon was another waiter. Used to sort of torture me over. The kitchen was in the basement, and we had a microphone and a video set up, and they would yell at me to send food up in the dumbwaiter.
Oh, no.
and Ralph and I and Steve became really good friends. And Sandy at that time was working at for Mondavi as a tour director, and she hated me.
Yeah,
hated me from day one. And
how's that
so
possible?
She just did. It was a long story. Some other time we'll talk about it. But
sure.
in any case, when I moved down to LA to become work at Michael's, and Ralph and Sandy. Ralph came down to LA because he was going to film school at UCLA, and so we sort of reconnected. And at that point, Sandy, Ralph, and I became somewhat inseparable. And
that's funny. That's really funny.
So we've been really great friends since 1977.
She's a character. She called the other day looking for a place to move a lot of rosé real fast. She extended herself a little long, but I think I've been buying from her for, I don't know, 20 years, at least 20 years. And Mark, the sales guy, was telling me, he goes, well, I asked Jonathan, where should I go in Tennessee for a dinner? And you recommended this, I can't remember the name now, Western something, but it's a fried bologna sandwich. You wanted to make sure I mentioned that.
Oh, so that's it's called
the great Waxman is asking for recommending a fried bologna sandwich. Okay.
Well, there's a wonderful honky tonk called Roberts on Broadway in Nashville, and it's a place that is the most egalitarian bar in the world, and they have the best Nashville groups that play there. There's no cover charge. There's seemingly they don't card anybody, but they give people the once over, and the only admission is that you go in and dance and listen to music and eat fried bologna sandwiches and drink cheap beer.
I don't know, man. That sounds pretty.
It really. It's really, honestly, it's. I took Giada there one night, and I don't think Giada's ever had a better time in her life dancing and
Oh,
having a
that's
great
funny.
time. It was
No
really,
pictures,
we
I
had a great
suppose.
time.
No pictures.
No pictures.
Okay,
I'm
good.
afraid.
Sorry. You touched on a couple things just through these stories. I was going to peel back anyways. We'll get to them, and we'll talk about your career, getting into the aha moment at Frère Tragueau and places like that. But you said something interesting, and it's kind of just started at my house, even though we've been doing this a long time. And that is, you said wine first, and then we're going to cook around the food. And I think so much of many people that like wine and maybe cook at home or go to dinner will start the other way. They'll start with, well, what am I eating and what should I drink? And I've become, when I get home now, particularly through confinement, like I feel like a Beaujolais. I feel like an aged Burgundy. I feel like, and then what should we eat? Is that that the way you approach it?
Well, it's sort of, I'm loath to use this word, but it's an organic process. Sandy and I go to the market in Santa Monica, and we shop for food and bring the food home and kind of lay it around, and then she starts talking about wine first. What do you want to drink? And I love that, because then you start thinking in your head, how can I turn this food into something that will marry up well with those wines we want to drink? Now, invariably, we don't stick to the program.
Yeah, well, that's
because you'll just everything like life goes sideways. But I think it's important. I think I was very lucky when I went to Berkeley for a short period of time, UC Berkeley, and I took an enology course, and it was back in the day when it was taught, very much on the old on the Davis standard. It was very textbook and chemistry oriented. It wasn't very passionate at all. But what was nice about it was I got to learn, so the core values of winemaking and the wine process. And because I worked at Domaine Chandon, I got to, go into the winery and wander around. They let me see everything. And the winemakers were very open about how they did things. And that really helped me along the way, I think, to understanding how important wine is in my world.
Well, so I'm going to venture to say your restaurants, embrace that concept, barbuto and jams, it's wherever, whereas that's an important part of the equation. And I wrote down here a note, because particularly with the Italian food, nothing makes me cringe more than when I see somebody come to, let's say, Union here in Pasadena, and open a bottle of Duckhorn Merlot when a som has spent a lot of time and energy to pair up the foods of the restaurant to the wine list and present to the public something that would be interesting to taste and be with. And I don't have any problem, of course, bringing wine to a restaurant. I think it's fine, but I just want to talk about wine's evolution with their indigenous foods. You spent time in France where you were near Lyon, in Rouen, right? Frère Tragueau. And
well, I was very lucky. I went to school in Paris. I went to La Varenne cooking school, and and I actually used to go take classes at the Blue Fox when it was Steven Spurrier. I didn't know Melvin and Steven had a relationship at that
friends,
time, and actually, and Tim Johnson was there and everything. But in any case, there was we took an Easter, classmates and I rented this horrible car that had a 2x4 holding up the front seat. And I said, let's go to all the best restaurants in France that we could afford. And the first restaurant we went to was Tragueau in Rouen. And I actually had been to a 3-star restaurant before that. I'd gone to Chez Denis, the famous Chez Denis in Paris, which was underwhelming at best. But I had to go because of that whole, article in the New York Times. But we went to, Tragueau, and number one, it was the middle of, the first of Easter. It was cold. It was snowy outside, but they welcomed us as if we were, like royalty.
Wow.
And they served this sort of classic foie gras menu of, the foie gras that was seared that I'd never had before, the fresh foie gras, and then they had this dish, the salmon au lasaille, which is, the famous dish with vermouth and cream. And then they had roast duck with cassis berries.
Wow.
and their famous cake. And then after the meal, they took us into the kitchen and showed us the kitchen. And, I don't remember the wine at all from that meal. But the next day, everybody abandoned ship except for one person, because they had just said, we're not going to eat like this the rest of our lives. We're done. So this one trencherman and I, and we were about to leave, and it was snowing, and Jean Trogo walks up to us. What are you guys doing for lunch? And we said, well, we were thinking about heading down the road. And he goes, oh, come and have lunch. It's on me. So he sat us down in the bar area of Trogo, and he just says, I'm going to cook for you. And he brings out a seau filled with ice and a pewter jug filled with fleury.
Wow.
Stuck it on ice.
Wow.
And it probably was the best meal I've ever had in my life.
Wow.
And they served this little dish. It was called panache of poisson, which are these little fish from the river. They're little sonde, and they were just poached in a little bit of courbillon with a little beurre blanc on top. And then we had light lunch. We had cote de boeuf with
of course.
With these gratin potatoes that they make at foie gras, and we just drank fleury with that.
So,
and I tell you, Paul, that to me was, sort of that awe moment where you realize that I was going to do this the rest of my life.
That's
it really
fascinating.
was. Yeah, it really was.
But you were in
sort
cooking school at the time, right?
I was, but I had no idea what I was doing.
Yeah.
So I was, as a musician that turned. I got convinced to go to cooking school and everything else. And it was that, seeing that kind of just perfectionism with everything was the graciousness, the hospitality, the service of the wine, everything else was so comfortable and so passionate. Yet, he didn't get in the way. He didn't come over and bug us during lunch. He just wanted to make sure we were happy. And it taught me a million lessons that day. And it really stuck with me.
Do you think that aha moment, I mean, it definitely has to happen in the wine business, and I'm going to guess it has to happen in the culinary side for you to take on that schedule, to take on the role of not only entrepreneur, but as chef, and then, with all the headaches and all the headwinds of opening a restaurant. I mean, isn't that where the passion comes from? A moment like that at Trois Gros where you're like, okay, I get it now?
100%. I had another one during that time period. I had this Austrian girlfriend who had a car. I didn't date her for the car,
all
by
their
the way.
benefits.
And one Sunday, I said, well, let's go out to the Champagne country and go wine tasting. Of course, we arrived too late for wine tasting on Sunday, and I realized that they were, they're Catholic and they don't do tastings a lot on Sundays. They go to lunch. So I looked in the guidebook, and there's this 2-star restaurant called Beaujolais, which was not in Rennes at that time, was out in the countryside near Epernay. And we showed up at this little country house and a Sunday lunch, and about 1:00 I walk in, and stupid me, of course they were booked, and probably months ahead of time. But the woman at the front looked at us and took pity on us, and they created this little tiny table for us off the side. And I remember sitting down and having a bottle of 61 Gosset.
Wow.
And the first course was a salad of mosh petals, lamb's tongue lettuce to people don't know what it is.
Right.
With olive oil, sea salt, and shaved Perigord truffles on top. And that was it.
That's it.
That was it. And you think about it, there was no real skill there other than perfection of choosing perfect ingredients, serving them perfectly, and having the restraint to not put too many things on the plate. and knowing what would go well with champagne. And I to this day, I try to emulate that. I never really can, because sometimes those ingredients, because they've been using it for hundreds of years, it's difficult to do that. But it was really, that was another awe moment, I think, for me.
It seems that cuisine then is that would you call that, because you're talking 19, what did you say, 70 or 80 something?
This is 1976.
Yeah. So was that Nouvelle cuisine? Did they have Nouvelle? I mean, it sounds Nouvelle. It doesn't sound like.
Yeah, it was. I would think what people now call Nouvelle cuisine,
Yeah.
and I think there's a lot of sort of controversy about what that meant. But what it meant was, I think these guys in France, and Freddie Girardet, of course, they were sort of tired of the sauces that were, that they cooked, a month ahead of time and just reconstituted, which is what a lot of restaurants did, because it was just economical. And they threw away the old roux, and they had natural reductions. But I think what it was more that the cooking got more delicate, and it got more refined, and food became prettier.
Mm-hmm.
It looked better on the plate. There was a strong, obviously, Bocuse and Roger Verger and all those people, they had a certain style about what they did. And that style became what is known as Nouvelle cuisine. But what it really was taking the old classics and kind of reinventing them a little bit, or adjusting them. And I think that's evolution. It has to happen. Otherwise a business doesn't work, I think.
That's true.
And I really think that happens in everything. But I was very lucky to be in Paris when that was happening. So it served me well.
Well, it took until the 80s. I mean, one of my favorite subjects is haute cuisine in New York. Le Pavillon and Lutèce, and then why then did this idea that you're saying in '76 that you tasted in Lyon or Le Rouen, how did it land in America? Was Alice Waters like the linchpin of this idea moving forward, or was that an accident? And now that you're in New York, what was happening in New York at this time? Was it still the Le Pavillons and the Lutèces of the world that were pouring, bechamel and things?
I think if you had to pinpoint one area, it was Los Angeles. When certain chefs, like L'Orangerie and those restaurants, I think they were more in tune with what was going on, like in the south of France with Roger Verger and other places. And Alice was tangential in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that she was really influenced by some of those guys as much as she just had her own style. And it happened to be coincidental in many ways to what they were doing in France. Though, Pierre Trois-Gros sent his son to work at Chez Panisse right before I was at Chez Panisse. So
wow.
there was some sort of communication amongst chefs around between France and Italy and Switzerland and even in England at that point. And I think it's like any good idea, it spreads like wildfire, and people gravitated toward it. But it was hard to kind of pinpoint where it really sort of took place in America. Now, I love Lutèce, and Andre Soltner was sort of my uncle when I first moved to New York, and he was really my mentor. But his food was not what I would call, cutting edge food. He was much more of a classic.
Seemed very traditional, according to his cookbook, anyway.
Very, very traditional, which I really appreciated as well. Yeah, I think there's room for everything. So I think there's, that's why I really appreciate when people do go back to the classics and do sort of channel, older recipes, which is what Alice really did at Chez Panisse. She went back to old books and she looked up recipes, but she probably did serve them in her style, which probably could be called Nouvelle cuisine, which is kind of interesting.
Well, I have to tell you, after the 100-foot journey, I haven't told you, my daughter My daughter's a boulangère in New York. She went to East Saint-Jean for pastry school, and she ended up at the New York French cooking school. She worked for Benno for a while. When they earned the star, she was the boulangère of record for the Michelin star they earned, which they now are closed and won't reopen. So we've seen a lot of the passion it takes to do this. But I've tried to make the 5 mother sauces. Now, I think I got the sauce tomate kind of under control, the bechamels and things. But, man, I could not eat the Espagnole. I tried to make the beef broth from scratch, and it was I don't know.
Well,
I don't know what
Paul,
I did wrong.
I'll tell you a funny story about sauce Espagnole. So one of my jobs before Chez Panisse, I went from Domaine Chandon. I went to work in Monterey at the Monterey Bistro, which is no longer there. And the owner was this old German guy who was very classically trained from the 40s and 50s. And his chef was this very small, wiry, very nice French guy. And I said, so, how do you make your sauces? And he comes in and shows me in the walk-in. There was this 24-gallon vat of sauce Espagnole.
Really?
I said, so how often do you make it? He goes, I make it once every 3 months. And so I would happen to be there on the day he made it. And literally he made this big vat of beef bone broth in one pot, and he cooked it overnight. And he put a can of tomato paste in and 2 cans of tomatoes. And it was this bubbling cauldron of beef madness. And then his other pot, he made this roux with a number 10 can of flour and oil. And he made this roux, and then he sifted, this cauldron of beef broth into the roux and cooked it for about an hour and a half, this bubbling thing. And it stiffened up like glue. And stuck in the walk-in, and every day he would go in and scoop up another service that night. And you think about it, and that was what people had done for years.
Yeah.
But real sauce Espagnole, when I was at Chez Panisse and other places that we did, really it's a wonderful sauce. If it's done correctly, it's really amazing.
Well, you're lucky you didn't go on day 29. Because that's like the time I would have had sushi in Mammoth, and it was the day before the fresh shipment was coming in. It's just not
exactly.
Right. Yeah, it's an important this aha moment. Just for reflecting on that a second, do you think for a young chef, and I'm going to say this from experience, when my daughter was looking for places to learn how to cook and bake, we went to ICA in Napa and listened to that speech, and we went to the one in New York, and it seemed like at that moment, the pitch by the chef was more about, well, if you don't want to go to college, you can come to food school, and then we're gonna make you. Well, everybody thinks they're going to be a TV chef, but it seemed like more of an outlet for people that didn't want to go to college than it was for passionate people to learn how to cook, or at least the techniques of cooking, to go do something, because this is a tough industry and it takes a lot of energy and passion. I mean, just watching my daughter get up at 3 a.m. to go bake, is enough. If you can't do it without that passion. What's the current temperature for coming into the industry for young chefs?
Well, obviously COVID is throwing everything for a loop. But heretofore, I think one of the big pushes that my friends and colleagues and peers are trying to do is throw a wider net to attract more individuals into our business. And I think, that for good or bad, TV has drawn people to our business. Mm-hmm. So they see people like Bobby Flay and Giada and Michael Simon and people like that, and they say, well, they look happy and successful and rich, and they're doing something they love. I'd like to do that. And the problem is that it, as you and I well know, it's tough work. The old adage is, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen, because the kitchens they're hot, they're sweaty, they're uncomfortable, they're just delicious. Loud. I love being in the kitchen. But you have to be that type of person. Now, do you have to be in the kitchen to be a chef? Absolutely not. You could work as a private chef in someone's home. You could do what your daughter does and, work in a different department where you don't have to work on the line. You have a different style of cooking. You could be a pastry chef. You can make ice cream. There's lots of different facets of it. There are certain people that are very good at just the economics of food, and they go into the business part of it, which is, I think, one part of my business which I think is sorely lacking. I like to be able to attract more MBAs, more people that are business trained individuals that would like to be in the food business. But the most important part of the food business is that it really is like a family. And the culture that I was lucky to, glom onto very early on, and hopefully, in my restaurants, I try to emulate that, is that we try to create places where people can grow as individuals. And the most important thing I think about is trying to elicit people's passion and find out what they're good at. And a lot of people are very shy, and they're reticent about talking about what they really like and really want to do. And I feel that's kind of, I'm a pretty good mentor in that respect. And, I try to get out of people what they're good at. And I think, we all should find that little spark in our belly, or that little fire, whatever you want to be. If you want to become a welder, you want to become a doctor, you want to become a winemaker, whatever it is, that little passion will make you happy.
It sounds like you have the business part of it down pretty well. I mean, maybe the numbers aren't so great when it comes to whether you sit around and look at them, but certainly how to grow a staff in an environment that's quick and hot and fast paced and filled with, sometimes complaining customers. And you're tapping into the resources of each employee to maximize their experience with you. Anyway, that's a huge part of business, isn't that?
Yeah, I think that, you look at it rather than a business, you look at it as a family, and that they're part of your family. They're part of your sort of extended family, and that, you, even when they leave, you still feel responsible. Like I was talking to Mark Peel, who was Nancy's husband at Campanile the other day, and he still says, you're still my boss. From 1980, I'm still his boss. And I always laugh about that. But I think to be a good boss is a difficult thing, and you make a lot of mistakes, and you do a lot of silly things, and you say stupid things sometimes. But if your intent is correct, and you're mindful of your place in your business, the most important thing is making good food for people.
For sure.
I think that at the end of the day, if that's the goal, that's ever present. So I think I've been lucky in that respect that I didn't shy away from that.
You brought up an interesting point, because in Andre's book, and I talked to him yesterday, by the way, Mr. Soltner, Chef Soltner. I don't call him Andre, we're not that close, but he's gonna be on the show pretty soon when he gets back from a trip he's taking. But he talks about in the book that, he didn't really pay attention to the numbers. I forgot who he was talking about, his wife or somebody was doing the numbers, and he didn't really care. He ordered what he wanted to order, and he made what he wanted to make. And they would tell him, toward the end of the month, maybe that things aren't looking so great, that we got to do this or do that. And in today's environment, and my wife's cousin owns a restaurant here in Pasadena called Mi Piace. It's been around 30 years, which is a huge time frame in certain Southern California for restaurants. And it's not so easy. I mean, it's just not that easy these days with the cost of labor and the cost of government and the cost of food, and you want to produce high quality food that tastes good. You got to find good food that tastes good. How is this relate to this? Is really what the question is. You've got chef centric restaurants like yours,
right?
Like Espago, like Chez Panisse, and then you have corporate restaurants. And here's like a Danny Meyer who's got like this amazing chain of, burger joints and a couple of restaurants in New York or maybe more. How does a restaurant like that, like yours, manage all those pieces still squeak out a profit so you can be there the next day and employ all the people that you're mentoring? I mean, how does that happen these days?
Paul, I'm going to say this and you're going to laugh, but a lot of it's luck.
Well,
yeah, it's
sure.
I'll tell you a funny story. So when Barbuto was about 5 years old, it was 2009. The crash had just happened in New York and obviously the world, and our business just dropped precipitously. And it was the darkest days in January of 2009. And certain people told me that I was going to go out of business. And, that didn't sit well with me. So I fought as hard as I could.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got a call from this woman, Sarah Abel, who was my PR person for Baltz and Company in New York. And she says, Jonathan, I want you to do this TV show called Top Chef Masters. And I said, I'm not doing a TV show. That's, Bobby Flay worked for me and Bobby did great. And, I was Bobby's mentor and he worked for me for a long time and he did great. I said, I'm not going to be, I'm not Bobby Flay. I'm too ugly and I don't want to be on camera. And she kept pestering me. And I just told her to please don't do it. And then I got a phone call from Tom Colicchio and he goes, Jonathan, just fucking do it. And I went on the show. And we went from 0 to 100 miles an hour in April.
Wow. In the restaurant.
Doing the TV show. Now, that wasn't serendipity. That was sheer magic of, TV. And I was very lucky to, number one, have lasted as long. I was trying to get fired every week I was on TV because it was just so I was so out of shape and old and tired. And I wanted to go home. But at the end of the day, Paul, what was interesting to me was that, number one, I love doing TV. So I was wrong about that.
Worked out.
And that worked out. But it was miraculous for my restaurant. Now, think about someone else who doesn't have that ability to be on TV or, have that exposure. How do they make it work? I think you just have to grin and bear it. And you just have to use every ounce of intellectual and physical power to make things work. And it's a tough business.
And never sacrifice the quality of the food.
No, but I think it's tough. But I think that the tougher it is, sometimes the harder you try, and the harder you try, the better the product becomes.
It's true. So prune. I just thought of that. She, unbelievably eloquent article that she wrote about closing. And my anecdotal story with that is that when we decided, after my daughter graduated from University of Southern California, I said, now if you want to go to cooking school, you find, so she went to East San Joe. I told you that. We're going to send her to New York, and she's going to go to the French cooking school, which I think is now ICC, which is now closed. She calls and says, well, I'm not going to go to school now. I go, what do you mean? She goes, well, Prune offered me a job. I'm like, you're not, because a lot of chefs have told her, cooking school is not that important. Get yourself on the line and get work in. And so she toyed with this idea, but I paid a lot of money to send her to New York and get her an apartment. She's not going to just do this. And then we learned that, what a sad environment. If she's coming back or any rumor of what's going on with Prune in the future? Well,
the good thing about Gabriella is that she is a magnificent writer.
Yeah,
and
clearly
she'll be able to channel that into a bank account that's sustainable. That's number one. Number two is that I do hope she comes back. I hope restaurants of her type will come back. I have no idea.
Yeah.
I think now that New York got smart and is allowing, restaurant workers to get vaccinated, I think that's a game changer for everybody.
For sure.
Because that was the thing that really has prevented me from reopening was the safety of my customers and my staff. And I think now that we have the wherewithal to protect the staff initially, and hopefully customers as well, that will create some hope. But I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know.
Is Barbuto
I
coming
really
back?
don't know. I don't know.
Tough one to call. You mentioned the TV talk, being on TV, being so important, or having been so important for the restaurant. How important is the Michelin étoile, the book, the guide, 3 stars. How important is that to the career of a restaurant, at least at that level of food quality you're trying to present?
Well, when I went to France in the mid '70s, and Michelin Guide was everything. If you got in the Michelin Guide, you got a star, 2 stars, 3 stars. That was the ultimate.
Mm-hmm.
That was everything, and I bought into that philosophy of pleasing the Michelin style person or whoever made that guide. And when Michelin decided to go worldwide, I thought that was really interesting. But I still think back in the day when it was just centered really in France and a little bit in other countries that were connected to France, it was a little tighter, a little more succinct. But it's a valuable guide. I still use it. It's right next to my toilet. I always have a Michelin guide there. I'll be honest with you.
Great place for it.
And I think that the romance of finding that little restaurant tucked. You talked about the 100-foot journey, tucked into a village that you have to drive hours to, or your car breaks down in front of this 2-star restaurant that you didn't know existed.
Right.
And you walk in tired and hungry, and the word restaurant means to restore one's spirit. And that's what the Michelin Guide to me means, that you find this place. There's a little place that I go to. We go every summer to Taloir. A friend of mine has this wonderful house there. We go every summer, spend 2 or 3 weeks there. And there's this restaurant that I found that's about an hour away outside of Aix-les-Bains. And it's this young couple in this beautiful little restaurant overlooking the vineyards of this, Savoie vineyards. And, I went in there for the first time. I brought my 2 sons and a couple other people, and it was a revelation, Paul.
Wow.
Here's this young couple out in the middle of nowhere cooking food that was magical, and it was of a place. It wasn't importing lobsters from Brittany and, lamb from Germany. It was all food from that region, from that little valley.
Wow.
And you could taste it. And then you had the wines, all these amazing, wines from that region that are extraordinary, that don't travel. You'd never see them in this country. Kermit Lynch has a few of them, things like that. But seeing that sort of dedication, they probably have 12 tables, 15 tables.
Wow.
To me, that's the Michelin Guide. That's it in a nutshell.
It seems like food and wine obviously are partners, but the idea behind going to a place like that in a restaurant that's tucked away, that's only using local foods, that's somebody else's hands preparing, and they come up with flavors that maybe Jonathan Waxman's never tasted before, and that can change from vintage to vintage, for instance, with a wine, and how complicated and infinite the idea of good food can be, and finding little places like this. I don't know if my listeners know that the Michelin Guide was started like in the late 20s, early 30s, and it was meant for you to drive out of Paris and go use up your tires so that you have to buy more tires from the Michelin people. I mean, that's what the whole point was. So, and I find that fascinating to have learned that. So there's a movie, I don't know if you've seen it. And my French, I take French, but the English translation is the wing or the thigh, l'huile de cuisse, le cuisse. It's a funny movie. It's in French. It's probably from the 70s. It's about 2 competing food guide people, and they're trying to sabotage each other. And it's a huge slapstick comedy. So if you haven't seen it,
I love that. Well, it's interesting you say that. When the reason I went to Paris in the first place, one of the reasons was I saw this guide called the Juilliard Guide to Food. Mm-hmm. It was written by Goemio, and so when I went to France, and Goemio at that time was actually more influential and probably a little more avant-garde than Michelin. And so you looked at Goemio to find the Nouvelle Cuisine restaurants. And they were more, I think, a little more topical, not as stodgy as Michelin was. Michelin was a little more comme il faut, a little more traditional. But I felt that they really were warring against each
Right.
other.
I think that's what made what it was.
And I love that. I love that sort of juxtaposition. Now in Italy, funny enough, they have a lot of guides. And, when you go there and you go to the bookstore, there's like 8 or 9 guides of food that are all very competitive, and they're very dense, and they go into, they're very wordy, and they're talking about these places. And I wonder how do they have the time to do that? Go to these restaurants and all they do is drink and eat and write, these flowery phrases about these restaurants. But it informed me about where to go. So that was important.
Well, it's, the contemporary app. I don't use any of them. Foursquare, Yelp, I don't care, because I can't trust a bunch of people, and you can't trust those ratings anymore anyway, because they're so congested with false information. And so that's what I find refreshing about the guide, is that at least that there's a baseline of quality, a baseline of what food should be and service should be, that you have a reasonable expectation that the food's going to have it's going to survive your expectations. There is a dive. What's the name of the show? Drive-ins, diners, and dives. Guy Fieri's show, and there's an app, and I've used it for fun, and I'm like 50-50 with it. I mean, I went to one place in Tennessee. It was like bad. It was really bad. And so, I thought,
but I think like anything, you want it to be a fresh guide.
That's true. You want it to be a fresh guide.
you want it to be newly minted. You want it to get, you want to make sure.
I should look at the air date of that show. Maybe it was a problem.
Exactly. And I think, listen, the restaurant business, things happen. So,
that's true.
Restaurant changes hands. So, you never know.
I wanted to shift gears a little bit. You're in Italy, and you don't tell this to the French, but when Catherine Medici came from Florence, and she married King Henry? She brought with her these Italian cooks, and it's purported that she, taught the French how to cook. The Russians taught you how to serve food, and they taught you how to cook. But there's such a dramatic difference between Italian and French cooking. I find that hard to believe, or find it interesting to believe. But how important in America were the immigrants that came here, bringing what they didn't know was necessarily any kind of cuisine to the extent that now Armenian food or Russian food or Chinese food or Italian food is the staples of what we eat. But how important is that immigration?
Well, I was very lucky. My parents, my father's from the Bronx and my mother was from Bed-Stuy, and they moved out to California, I always say ostensibly to have me in 1950 or 49. And I remember as a young kid, my mother was an intrepid cook and diner. And she would travel to Fresno to buy grape leaves to make dolmas. She would
really
go into Chinatown to find rice noodles. She would scour these. There's a place called Ratto's in Oakland. The barrels to find the best olives and
wow,
the best olive oil. And and I've never understood how she had that passion. I mean, it didn't. It was never really explained to me. But I think, we're very lucky, Paul, because you think about all these people that have brought their contribution to American soil, whether it be Greek, Thai, all the regions of India, all the regions of China, Japan, Korea. I mean, it's amazing. I think we're so lucky.
We are.
I think the layers that are available to us now, if you go to any supermarket or any farmer's market and you see the amount of food and the rainbow effect of all these different cultures colliding in the supermarket, I think it's fantastic.
Do you think the new world, like, these people came, like I said, they didn't know what they came, they brought their food, they made it at home because that's what they had to do. But do you think that the part of that, our food culture, is because we had nothing indigenous? I mean, we didn't, maybe corn, right? I mean, we had an open book, and Jacques Lardier said it from Louis Jadot, like, that's what the new world's about. there's no shackles. We're not forced to grow Pinot Noir here. So
yeah, I think there's a little bit of that, but I always loved the idea, like I read when I was reading Lonesome Dove about, the going along the prairie and knocking a prairie chicken over the head and roasting over the fire. We had things we didn't grow a lot of stuff, though. The Native Americans really did have a food culture that we're just now finding more about. Anastasia corn, for instance, back from the 12th century. There's anthropologists are still gleaning what was here, but I think in a way that it was really like, think of these guys from Genoa going to San Francisco. They went to another port, and they knew how to fish, and that was not alien to them. They became fishermen, but then they brought their wine stocks with them. So they brought up to Napa Valley and they planted them. They planted olives. They wanted to have the food from their country. So they started growing these things. And then other cultures did the same thing, bringing their little bits and pieces from home, or right to their cousins in the old country. Can you send me some, some asparagus or whatever? Yeah. And as that developed, and people started becoming, I remember the whole story about Meyer lemons. Fred Meyer from, this botanist from California went to China and found this, this crazy lemon. He brought it back, and now we have Meyer lemons everywhere in the world.
Yeah,
think about avocado. Think about exactly. Think about avocados. Think about all these different. Think about blood oranges. When I was a kid, oranges were orange.
Yeah. I
didn't know it. Blood. When I first went to Venice and I had blood orange juice, I
so
thought
good.
They were kidding me.
Yeah.
But it was the greatest thing ever. So I think we're so lucky that these people brought their food with them.
That's true.
And not just their food, but their recipes. About how to do. I'm in love with Mexican food. I really am. I'm just gaga over Mexican food.
Come to LA and open a decent place, will you?
And I'm enthusiastic about flavor in particular. I'm enthusiastic about colors in food. I'm enthusiastic, but as I get older, I'm also more in tune about how food affects us, both, in our deepest soul, but that we're healthy with it. And, so the amount of things that I've changed my way of eating dramatically. And I realized that I'm enjoying food more. I'm tasting it better now. I love, like,
that's really
for COVID.
interesting.
Well, for COVID, my wife or my daughter would go to the farmer's market and they just buy whatever they want, and then they put it out and they okay. And they would go off do something, and they say, "Okay, hopefully dinner will arrive in 2 hours," and I love that. And the things they bring back from the farmers market are astounding, Paul. I mean, think about Jerusalem artichokes. When I was a kid, there wasn't. Maybe they existed, but I didn't actually see them. I think they're the most amazing vegetable on the planet, and they're really good for you. And who knew? So I'm enthusiastic even more about what the future of food will be in America. And going back to that story about trying to get, people involved in our business, so it's hard. Who cares? Life is hard.
Yeah,
it doesn't really matter. It's like anything, it's only hard for the first 4 or 5 years.
Well, but if you have the passion, like, this is my 31st year. I've tasted 100,000 wines. I don't think it really hit me until maybe 5, 7, 10 years ago. There was something very special about what we were doing and unique about what we were doing and the product that we were selling. And it's no longer work now. I like coming to work. I like turning people on to really interesting vintages of wine that they can hold in a glass and go, I either want to taste this again and figure out what it is, or, I'll move on to the next one. But whatever it is, I challenged you to do something, with your palate. In fact, the other day I couldn't believe it. I bought 2 cases just for my cellar, a wine from the Canary Islands. And when you, in my database of wines that when I taste, I put everything in a database. And if I start to spell a grape, that's already in the system, it pops up and says, this must be Chardonnay, this must be Cabernet. And nothing was coming up when I was putting Listan Negro. And I'm like, I had never tasted the grape. I had never tasted a wine from the Canary Islands. And it was volcanic all the way. It was absolutely fascinating wine. I said, I got to put this in my own cellar. And that's exciting. That's exciting.
It's really, those little discoveries are so great.
It's really fun.
One thing, when I started doing this, I mean, the only reason I did Barbuda was, my new neighbor upstairs from me here in New York is Italian fashion photographer, Fabrizio Ferri, and he and his wife, Alessandra Ferri, who's at that time was the most famous ballerina in the world, had moved in upstairs from me. And they used to sneak downstairs, and I'd be cooking dinner, and Fabrizio is this big bear-like guy, and he would come in and invite himself to dinner. We became friends. And he said, Jonathan, you have this restaurant called Washington Park, but I had this little space on Washington Street. Would you ever think about opening a restaurant? So I said, no, I don't want to do it. So he said, just come over and see it. So I walked over there with Jimmy Bradley from the Red Cap, and I walked by, and Jimmy Bradley said, that's a dump. And I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. Anyway, so Fabrizio kept bugging me. So I finally said, yeah, I'll do this restaurant with you. And I said, what kind of, he goes, we're going to be doing an Italian restaurant. I said, I'm a nice Jewish boy from Berkeley. I don't do Italian food. I'm not worthy of that. He goes, no, Jonathan, you don't get it. You cook like my Roman mother. I said, what are you talking about? He goes,
that's funny.
You're not from the same place. You don't have the same, cultural background. So I opened up an Italian restaurant. But what was great about that was that I got to go to Italy and start doing more wine tasting. Now I had, with Tim Johnson and Mark Williamson, I actually done the first Trebicchieri tasting in Alba, Piedmont in the 90s. And
wow.
So I've been going to Italy a lot for wine and for food, and I just loved it. But now I got to go back, and I realized the hidden treasures of Italy. And one of them were these little wines in these little regions that I'd never heard of.
Oh,
and and all of a sudden you discover this stuff, and it just boggles your mind. And I love that discovery. It's like Paolo Bea. First time I drank one of the Sagratinos, I almost fainted. I'm sorry, but it was such a revelation for me. Because listen, I love Côte Rôtie, I love all those great wines, the Rhone and blah blah blah. But I had this wine, the Sagratino from Paolo Bea, and it's still to me like a temple.
They're fabulous.
How does that person take a simple grape off the vine, and turn it into this magical substance? And so that was very lucky for me, and that's why a part of Barbudo, I think, was such a treasure for me, because I got to put those wines in the wine list. And, occasionally I would pop a bottle open, and Michael Kelly, who's my wine director, who's been with me since day one, we've gone on the journey together. And since then he's, not just been Italian centric. He travels the world wine wise. But his palate and mine are very similar. And we talk about this thing about marrying food and wine. I think my food is so simple that it's not wine agnostic, but it does have a wider, I think, palette in terms of what could go well with my food. And I like that. I like being able to sit down. But do you want a simple glass of rosé, or do you want to have a glass of champagne with a certain dish? They both will work well. They'll marry well with that dish. You'll have a different flavor profile, and you'll have a different experience, which I think is fantastic. I love that.
Next time you go to Montefalco, my friend is the mayor, retired mayor there, Valentino Valentini. Okay, the guy should have been right? He should have been a movie star or something. We're getting on an hour here, and I want to touch one subject. We have so much. Sure. There's so much still we could share. I wouldn't even talk about the Michael's restaurant days, but we used to go to this San Francisco Food Festival every year, fancy food festival. And I used to do the whole show. We'd walk up and down, and I always had this question. I asked chefs and I asked friends, and the question is this: I'm standing at the booth where they're selling bone sucking barbecue sauce or something, and I asked the young man. I said, "Okay, I'm going to ask you a question. If I brought forward from 1945 or 1958 or somewhere in that range a reputable steak from a reputable steakhouse, in other words, it wasn't one of the charlatan beef people that, why the USDA got involved, right? A real steakhouse. And you put it next to a steak from, let's say, Fleming's or Ruth's Chris or one of today's steakhouses. Which one would taste better?" And he says, "Well, let me ask my mom, because she used to serve at one of those steakhouses in the 40s. and so over comes this woman. She must have been 90. She says, absolutely, the steak from 1940 would be better. And we've got places like Blue Hill Farms with biodynamic foods and obviously wine and organic wines and biodynamic wines and raw wines. All these new evolution of wine business is happening. And the concept of you are what you eat eats, and you are what you drink drinks. How does that play in when I say the quality of the food? I mean, if you and I went to the market together and I went to the organic section and you went to the conventional section, vice versa, and we cooked everything exactly the same temperature, the same serving, would one necessarily taste better?
That's such a subjective thing, Paul. I think it's so hard. It's such a huge subject. I'll tell you a funny story. So my uncle worked at Hebrew National in their butcher in the 50s, and when they come to our house in New York, from New York to California, he used to bring what was called shell steaks. We're talking about 1961, 62. And I remember the eye of the steak was about 8 or 9 inches, and it was perfectly marbled.
Wow.
And, I remember the taste of that steak right now. And I think, going back to that whole Blue Hill thing, I think what Dan and other people are doing is they're trying to get back to what steaks were like in 1940.
I think you're right. Right.
I think before there was pesticides and before there was, mechanized growing machines, and before there was, all this stuff, people they survived. I grew up on a farm in Sonoma. We had composting because you had to do it. Right. We had, we dug out the weeds because you had to do it. But I remember putting a board on top of the blackberry bush in my grandmother's backyard and picking a pail of blackberries and coming back with an empty pail. And my grandma says, "Well, what happened to blackberries?" And she looked at me because I was smeared with blackberry juice. I think, these kind of things are what bring me back to those basics.
Right.
And I applaud anybody that tries to do that. So, whether it's conventional farming or organic farming, as long as it's done with love and care, I think it tastes pretty good.
Yeah,
I mean? Does that make sense?
It does. And I think you're right. It comes down to how much passion you have in preparing it and growing it. I mean, if you can, I'm sure conventionally you grow beautiful vegetables and beautiful fruit that tastes really good if you care. If you're just doing it for the work, that's probably a different story. But
and you need a mentor. You need to learn from somebody, or you learn by mistake, which is the hardest way of doing it, because that's the way I've done it. It's far better to have learned from a master, whoever that person is. That 90-year-old woman in the back is who I'd want to learn from.
The part that gets to me is they bring the wines in here, for instance, and I had a great conversation with Isabelle Legeron. She's got the raw movement. I had a conversation, which is a book you should read if you haven't, called the Hotel at Place Vendôme. It's Thilard Mazio, who wrote Veuve Clicquot's book, Widow Clicquot. But she talks about the liberation of Paris. It's phenomenal. She turns out, since I love the book, I was talking to her, she has a sparkling wine house on Vancouver Island, probably the least hospitable place in the world to grow champagne grapes. And she closed because of COVID, but she doesn't even disgorge her sparkling wine. So you get this wine, which now reading Widow Clicquot was the wines from the 1750s, where they didn't know how to get the stuff out of there. So now they're trying to figure it out. And she wants to sell it that way. So, but the point I was going to make is I taste a lot of, these really bad. It's like, I don't want to drink it just because I think I'm doing myself a favor, even though it's still 14% alcohol. I don't want to have to stomach it just because it's raw or organic or biodynamic. I want to enjoy it. I want to emote over it. I want to have a conversation about it.
Right.
So I'm not going to force myself to drink something because I think it's contemporary and hip to do, it should taste good. I mean, it should still create experience.
I mean,
for you.
isn't that the bottom line? That's why I think tasting blind is so important.
Yes.
That, that you really should not know what's in the bottle. Or I mean, or you should guess. You shouldn't see the shape of the bottle, but you pour it in the glass, and you know right away.
Right.
You're going to pinpoint it to
Pretty close.
a relative degree, and as soon as you smell it, and people think, well, you have to taste it. No, as soon as you smell it, you're 90% there. And I think that's the beauty of winemaking, because it's about the winemaker.
Yep.
And the terroir. And putting those two things together, that's why I love going to Piedmont. I stay with Pio Buffo from Pio Cesare, and I love walking with him in the vineyards. I love going out and getting my I love getting my fingernails into that dirt and seeing those steep trails in Barolo, walking around, and
wow,
it's so
I can smell
romantic.
It and hear it.
It's so romantic and so beautiful. But then you sit down at the table and you try 2007 Barolos, and they're all so different.
It's good work if you can get it.
Say same year, so different. Like children.
It is a fascinating part of I mean, that is that's the part about wine that's different than any other beverage in the world, right? I mean, you drink Jack Daniels, it tastes like Jack Daniels. You drink a Heineken, it tastes like Heineken. But you drink a Barolo from the specific district because it's going to taste different the next year and the year after that and the year after that. And that's the part that, to me, is fascinating about grape and the grape taking on the terroir and the winemaker really getting out of the way to let that express itself.
That's hard. That's really hard, Paul. Really hard. You think about it. It's really hard not to intervene.
Yeah,
not to try to tinker with your product. It's what chefs do. Chefs tinker too much.
We're past an hour, Chef, and I don't want to take any more of your time. I hope we can do it again. I do want to talk about your 3 books real fast. We've got the latest is the Barbuto, which is recipes from the restaurant.
They are,
and the simple recipes we're talking about.
We're trying to talk about what the quintessential Barbuto recipe is, and carbonara comes to mind. It's good pasta, good guanciale, good eggs, and good cheese,
and that's it. What else? What else is there in life?
I mean, you think about it, but it's how it's cooked and how it comes together, which is the magic.
And coming from your hands, we've got the Great American Cook, which is more traditional American type recipes. That's
more recipes from jams, and it sort of channels, my love of regional American cooking, and I'm such a lover of New Orleans food and Southwestern food and food of the Northeast. I could live in Maine, but it's my sort of little ode to American food, and I'm an American boy. What can I say?
Do, huh? And your first book was Italian My Way. That was first, right?
Yeah, that was my second book.
Okay, so Great American
Book was first, and Italian My Way was really kind of my love poem to my travels in Italy, and I got to spend vacations with Alice Waters in Siena, and I got to hang out in Positano with this and eat amazing. Italy is remarkable in terms of food, and the more you go, the better you like it.
John, I'm Chef. Thank you again for the time. Hope we can do it again. We are due in New York. Nothing can be open if you're going to open again, but we're going to be out there visiting my daughter. She's having her first child.
Congratulations!
Late this month. She lives in Manhattan Village, and she just got off a short stint with Daily Provisions. She revamped their bread program and got them some fresh. So have a crack at the multi-grain and multi.
And Danny is so amazing. I mean, to have that sort of vision, and what's her first name?
Lisa.
So
good she just finished it about, I don't know. They called her in and said, "Can you help us with this program?" She spent about 3 weeks, and they just released the breads, I think, last week.
You must be so proud.
Really? Seriously, before we get off, I'm not sure that I would have ever felt that before. I'm Armenian, and you're Jewish, so you know what pressure the parents would put on for other careers and do things, and why can't you be like your? And when she got back from France and she worked here in Southern California, she worked at Superba, she did their breads, and then went to New York and worked for Lincoln. She worked at Lincoln with Jonathan Beno.
Oh,
and
great!
Jonathan grabbed her and brought her to Beno and Leonelli. So I can't tell you how proud I am about somebody who's pursued her passion and her love of cooking and bread. In fact, when she played softball in high school, when I got home from work and she was baking, she had had a bad day on the field. This was her like release to just regroup
So cool.
herself, and she was destined to do this. And so I never thought I'd be proud of having a baker. And I'm
what
so
to me
it's
it's magical.
It is magic.
And it really is, and it's, to me, it's they're the real magicians.
They
in
are.
our field. They're fantastic.
I look forward to one day having a glass with you, Chef, and if you
Or two.
if you do, or two, if you do get out to Southern California and you hang out with Sandy, maybe we'll have a chance to do that.
I would love to.
Cheers.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Very good, Chef. Thank you.